Hello, Illinois. Today, I am joined by two reporters from the Chicago Sun-Times. Stephanie, this is your first time on the Illinois podcast, so I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience of the Illinois podcast.
Awesome. Thank you, Cole. I'm Stephanie Zimmermann. I'm a consumer reporter at the Chicago Sun-Times. I've been covering consumer issues for a few decades, actually, at a variety of news sources. I view my beat really broadly. And when my editor approached me with this "what's in your weed" idea, I loved it. And I was so happy to be paired with the Sun-Times wonderful cannabis beat reporter, Tom Schuba.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to Tom. Why don't you go ahead and reintroduce yourself to the audience of the Illinois podcast? You've been on the show before.
Yeah. Hi. What do you call your audience? Do they have
What's up, Illinois?
Illinois. It's Tom. I'm back talking about weed on the podcast. Like Stephanie said, I'm the cannabis beat reporter for the Sun-Times and cover some other topics as well. And I'm just happy to be back here chatting about our investigation into cannabis testing.
Yeah. And let's dive right into that. Well, first of all, folks, if you want to read along while we talk about this, the links to all of the articles will be in the show notes. So if you want to go to Chicago Sun-Times and read these articles that Stephanie and Tom have worked together on, that'll be in the show notes. It's tough for me to figure out where to begin. So maybe I want to pitch it to you all. Maybe tell us about the beginnings of this investigation, how it came to be, and then maybe we can transition into the findings. Does that sound like a pretty natural path?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take that, Tom, if you don't mind. Yeah, we were tasked with a really open-ended question, which was, what's in your weed? Cannabis is so popular in Illinois. Just came online with adult recreational weed in January of 2020. Super popular, very lucrative, kind of expensive. And so we were just tasked with kind of a very open-ended question of what's in your weed? Is it as clean as it's purported to be? Because people pay high prices, they pay high taxes, and they are told that what the products that they're buying are vetted, tested, highly regulated, et cetera. So we started with that really open-ended question and no preconceived notions. We started assembling a database that eventually grew to, I think, over 3,100 entries of test results that the state regulators get. And these are from the cultivators. They're required to send any failed test to the state. So we started with that just to get a handle on what weed that never makes it to the shelves of dispensaries, what weed is failing for. And that gave us some kind of clues to potentially mold being a problem. Most of the flower samples that failed at the state level were failing for mold. So that kind of gave us some clues. We talked to a lot of experts. We ended up zeroing in on pre-rolls as one of the products that tends to have trouble, and it's probably, we're told, something to do with the processing of the pre-rolls. They tend to get if a product's going to get contaminated, pre-rolls are it. That's what we were told. So we ended up going on a shopping expedition and tested some of the stuff that we bought.
Well, very cool. Very cool. And so, I'm reading your article. Looks like you commissioned an independent state registered laboratory to sample some of the most popular cannabis products, like you said, pre-rolled joints, and like you mentioned, some of the most susceptible to the mold issues. And as I believe his name is, he's a James McRae, you mentioned in your article, he's a cannabis consultant. As he mentioned, this is a pretty common occurrence with pre-rolls because of the fact that the cannabis is broken up, and the disturbed plant material basically releases moisture in the process, mixes in naturally occurring mold spores that are in the air all around us. So just wanted to give that background for folks that were wondering, why are pre-rolls, more likely? So So yeah, you dropped it off to the independent state registered laboratory. Tell us like from there how you did it. I liked that. Just to I guess start off the thought, it looks like you just gave them the samples, but you didn't even like include a label or anything, just a number, you know.
Right. We came in and kind of followed their directions. I think these are friends of the pod for you at the good folks at Oracle
Yeah,
Labs did the
yeah.
testing for us. And so we went to Origo on the northwest side of Chicago, and we put on gloves and protective stuff, and just followed their directions on kind of how to transfer the samples from the containers we got at the stores, to what they needed to do their testing. And yeah, we kind of did like a blind sort of system where we just described letters and numbers so that we knew what the samples were when we got the results back, but they didn't particularly know, whose products they were testing.
Sure. Sure. Well, hey, tell us about the results. They were pretty they were probably what you expected based off of some of the data that you had access to, right?
I think the test results were somewhat surprising just because of the number of flunking results that we found. So we got 10 samples. 9 of them were pre-rolled joints. One of them was like a flower sample produced by Cresco. And what we found was 8 of the 9 pre-rolled joints failed, the battery of tests for different things, most notably yeast mold and other, different forms of bacteria. And yeah, I think when we got those results back, we were expecting maybe a few fails in the batch, but the fact that the vast majority of them, failed some of these things was certainly surprising. Stephanie, did you have any kind of thoughts?
Yeah, you know what? I have to say, I agree. I figured buying 10 products, and again, this is not a scientific study. This is a sampling. This is just like Tom and I going like any other consumer. We bought them from 8 different dispensaries, and we didn't walk in and say we were reporters. We just went in to buy weed like anybody would, right? So we had 10 samples, and I figured, like Tom, 1 or 2 of them is going to come back with something funny. But to get 8 out of the 9 pre-rolls flunking one of these microbiological tests was kind of surprising to me. And those are the microbiological testing in Illinois, just for your listeners, in case they don't know. They look for 5 main things. They're looking for yeast and mold, and then they're looking for different kinds of bacteria. They additionally test for some really nasty bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella, and all 10 of the samples were negative for those. So that was good. They also tested for heavy metals, and none of the 10 samples had heavy metals. They also tested for, oh my gosh, I think it was close to 50 or over 50 different kinds of pesticides, and all 10 samples also were fine for pesticides. And they also test for this substance or compounds called mycotoxins. And that's toxic compounds that are produced by fungi, I guess. And they were all negative for that as well. So that was the good news. The bad news was that 8 of the 9 pre-rolls failed one of these, either yeast and mold or one of the different types of bacteria. And 4 of the pre-rolls failed 4 tests. So that was kind of surprising to hear. We also tested for potency, and that was very interesting because the potency was of these 10 samples. I believe the flower sample was fine on everything. It passed everything with flying colors. But of these pre-rolls, the potency fluctuations, we had, I think, about 1/3 of them were what the labeled potency said. About 1/3 of them were lower than the labeled potency. So if you thought you were buying something that was going to give you a lot of bang for your buck, you would have been disappointed because they tested low. And then about 1/3 of them tested higher, weirdly, higher than the labeled potency. So we found all kinds of stuff, and it was really fascinating.
That is fascinating. I thought one of the most interesting things that you pointed out that I think is important for consumers to know is that, you know, Illinois has some pretty strict testing as compared to other states. You pointed out that the threshold, if you will, for microbiological contaminants such as mold, yeast, and various bacteria are measured in colony forming units per gram, or CFUG. So for Illinois, yeast and mold you're allowed up to 1,000 CFUG. But in Michigan, for adult use cannabis, you just to compare to another state industry, you're allowed up to 100,000 CFUG and up to 10,000 CFUG for medical cannabis. So the five samples that you had, of the five samples you had, as you pointed out, 4 could have been sold for adult use in Michigan, and 2 would have been good enough for medical use. It's just kind of interesting to point. I thought that was an interesting note to point out. While they did fail Illinois standards, for all intents and purposes, if this were to be a product tested in Michigan, it would still be on the shelves.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that was one thing that I kind of, and that's a theme, and I'm sure Tom has more to share about that, but just this whole kind of weird patchwork of different regulations in different states. I imagined somebody driving in a car on a cross-country road trip, driving through a bunch of states and stopping and visiting and touring different states, right? Depending on what state you were in, you could walk into a dispensary and buy weed that was subject to either very much looser or stricter regulations, depending on where you were. And that was one thing that really jumped out at us. I mean, Michigan's practically our neighbor. They could have 100 times the amount of mold and yeast than is allowed in Illinois for adult use recreational. And that's something that I think the industry has to grapple with as time goes on. Like, where do you set a limit? What limit makes sense, really? I don't know. Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this is something that advocates really hammer on, this strange patchwork that changes by state. And not only that, it seems to be constantly changing in each state. Like some places curtail and draw back or cut out completely testing for certain things. So what it's left us with is no real standard for gauging the safety of this, very lucrative product that's becoming more and more available across the country. And there's different perspectives on how to kind of view this. And one of them that was relayed by an expert in our story was that you kind of let these state by state experiments play out, right? And you kind of let each state decide their own standards. And then, after a certain point of time, then perhaps, real set, appropriate limits will become clear, and then those can be adapted kind of nationwide. So there is some disagreement on kind of how to, approach this. And you do, like I said, you have these people saying, oh, well, this is a reason why we need kind of, nationwide decriminalization so that we can kind of put this under the purview of federal agencies and have them set standards like they do for other consumer products. But then you have other people, like I said, saying, well, no, maybe this is the best way to figure out what the standard should be, rather than maybe having federal agencies come to potentially arbitrary limits. So, yeah, it's fascinating and interesting, definitely.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was interesting that you pointed out that has been maybe not alleged strongly in Illinois, but in other states, some cultivators are able to shop around for their laboratories, which is just interesting. The idea that you can choose your laboratory because to me, when you hear independently tested, cannabis, like this testing label, and this test was performed by an independent lab, you think of that as like maybe something the cultivator didn't have a choice in making. And so that's just an interesting thing I think you pointed out in the article. And another thing in that regard is that a lot of the labs that are functioning at a professional level and working even with the DEA hesitate to get involved because of the worries of losing that federal funding, for example. So.
You
Right.
know, that's a really good point, Cole. Sorry to jump in, but that was something. And to piggyback off of what Tom just said about the patchwork and the, whether eventually this will become legal on a national level, there is a lot of expertise, I think, that is missing because it's still a prohibited substance federally. You don't have maybe the academic minds on this because universities that get federal money are hesitating to get in on this. And like you mentioned, the labs that have DEA contracts, they don't want to jeopardize that revenue by taking on testing for private cannabis industry. So it's really kind of a shame because I feel like we're missing out on a lot of expertise because there is still this federal sort of cloud over it, right?
Absolutely. It's like a weird catch-22. Go ahead, Tom.
You were mentioning lab shopping, which is kind of this shadowy process that there's a lot of whispering about in the cannabis industry, and there have been some kind of firm allegations around. But the idea is that a cannabis producer will find a lab that may be willing to fudge numbers or give results that they think are the most attractive to them, in terms of obviously the big granddaddy of them all is the level of THC found in pot products. So yeah, this is something that, like you said, we haven't been embroiled by any real lab shopping scandal in the state of Illinois, but there definitely is whispers about this and claims that have been made about this happening. And so it's something that we were certainly aware of and wanted to point out in this context because just because of how weirdly regulated all of this stuff is, this seems to be somewhat commonplace in some states.
Another thing that's interesting is that in the process of reporting this story, we kept talking to the state officials and we kept asking them about, who's testing the testers, right? Who's watching the labs because of this. And like Tom said, there haven't been any concrete findings of lab shopping in Illinois. There's been whispers, but it has happened in other states, right? It's been proven there've been labs that have faced sanctions because of that kind of activity. So
Right.
we kept asking the regulators here, like, who's testing the testers? Who's watching the labs? And do you have any way to yourself independently confirm the findings of labs in Illinois? And they kept saying, no, we're not really set up to do that. And after months and months, I mean, gosh, Tom, was it like actually about a year of reporting altogether? Finally, at the end, the Department of Agriculture said that they are now going to build out their own state lab. And so the Department of Agriculture will have a facility eventually. We don't know when it's going to come online, but they will be able to backstop and double check the results if they need to, if something looks funny. So that's kind of an interesting innovation here in Illinois.
Yeah.
And a huge step because, how this process works right now is you have a private, in a lot of cases, corporation working with a private lab, and then the results of this process are just reported to the state. So, like Stephanie said, there isn't really a process of testing the testers at this point. Or, one of the ideas that we heard was kind of, you take a sample and you send it around to all the labs and see what the different results are from the same sample to kind of get a baseline. And we just don't have that right now. And so what it is it's left in the hands of the accountability of these companies and labs to be above board and to meet the regulations that are put forth by the state.
Yeah. And oh, Stephanie, were you about to jump in?
No. I mean, I just had one other sort of thought on all of that. It's
Sure.
important to note for your listeners that, in all of our reporting, we never felt like you could compare the weed you buy in a dispensary with something you would buy on the illicit market, like, weed just you get from your dealer or whatever. The thing, I always come back to money, right? Because I'm a consumer reporter. I feel like when you're paying the high prices and you're paying the high taxes, if they tell you it's clean, it should be clean. So that's my little thing that I just wanted to throw in.
Yeah. And on that note, that's a great, what you just said and what Tom said about, he kind of said what you said as well, watching the watchers or who's testing the testers. And like you mentioned, the Department of Ag setting up a lab. I fingers crossed that, it works out, but I wanted to transition maybe to the topic of transparency, because you kind of both just brought it up. Some people who oppose the legalization of cannabis have actually used examples that were listed in your article as arguments against it. And we don't have to go into that, but I actually think it. So like, for example, in June, Arizona officials announced a voluntary dispensary recall. Last winter, Canada recalled 330,000 packages of cannabis gummies. In February, the state of Nevada, all these recalls, they're listing like, oh, I thought the goal of legalizing cannabis was to make it safe. Just to take those on, I'm not asking, for you guys to weigh in, but to take those comments on, I feel like recalls are examples of the regulated market working. You would expect there to be recalls. Now, to segue to something you guys can comment about, because I try to avoid asking you guys, your opinion as reporters. You have reported that, we've seen this moldy weed, but there's not been any consumer alerts or recalls. And in fact, the law seems to be structured in a way that protects and makes it really hard to find information out about potential recalls. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, we did, through our reporting, we did learn about kind of this quiet recall process that's centered on a strain of cannabis that was grown by Verano at the Ataraxia facility that's called Mag Landrace, which is, from kind of going through your community's Reddit forum, it was apparently a pretty popular strain among medical patients and recreational consumers. And, but what seemed to happen was at a certain point, all of these reports started to come out that, hey, this kind of tastes a little funky. This kind of tastes a little moldy. And it seems like at some point, some of those reports, made it up the ladder. And there was a letter that was sent to dispensaries by state officials that said, quarantine, the Mag Landrace product from these specific flower lots, and hold them. And if you want to, you can alert your customers, about what's happening. If not, we're investigating, and we're going to look into this. So, that was kind of this weird example where, there seemed to be an issue with transparency. And, I think what you're saying is exactly what regulators would say is a recall is not an example that, these products are unsafe, writ large. It's that the system is working and that we're back checking things and that we're making sure that complaints are heard and that if there is something that's potentially dangerous, it's taken off the shelves. But in this case, it was largely kept quiet, aside from one major company alerting its customers and allowing them to get basically refunds or store credits for it. So yeah, I'm certainly curious whether there have been more of these that maybe we weren't able to dig up and get information on that was firm. But yeah, I think that the idea of a recall, though, is thanks, man, is is so interesting, you know, in the context of cannabis right now, because it draws these splashy headlines. We saw what happened in Michigan. This kind of brought the cannabis industry to a certain extent to a halt. I went to a dispensary in Michigan on Black Friday because my dad was like, they got great weed deals at my dispensary. So I went over there to check it out. And when I get there, I'm like, wow, the shelves are kind of bare. And I asked the clerk, and I'm like, what's the deal? Why is the supply so limited? She said, it's the recall. They've taken so much product. So these recalls can potentially have a real serious impact. But what the point is, I think, is to make sure that, you know, these programs are living up to the standards that they've set. But in the case of what happened in Illinois, it was a little suspicious that this wasn't made public from the start, and that you know, it was again left up to mostly major corporations to decide how they wanted to handle and mitigate this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I
I
thought that
I
was the
agree.
craziest thing. Go ahead, Stephanie. Sorry, I didn't.
I was just gonna say, you know, I was, and again, I approach everything I do as a consumer reporter. So I'm always thinking about people who spend their hard-earned money on something. And I was really disappointed with the lack of transparency in that recall that the Mag Landrace one that Tom referenced. You know, here they know there's a problem. Clearly, there's a problem with mold in several batches, and instead of the state doing something to inform the public, they basically leave it on the shoulders of the dispensaries to do it. And the other thing that's really bizarre about the regulation in Illinois, there's not like one cannabis authority. There's different places that have a different piece of the puzzle. So you've got the Department of Agriculture that's overseeing the cultivators. You have the Department of Business and Professional Regulation that's overseeing the dispensaries. You also have the Department of Public Health that has some input on medical stuff or whatnot. But so they put it on the backs of the dispensaries to either inform their customers or not. And I'm sure were plenty of people that spent their hard-earned money on this product. It was moldy and nobody ever told them about it. And to your point about recalls in general, I mean, I don't think that opponents of cannabis in general should use recalls as a reason to say that it's bad, because we get recalls all the time in food products. Like, think about the big
Or even
romaine lettuce
automobiles.
or automobiles. I mean, as a consumer reporter, I write about baby products, car seats, those baby sleeper things. I write about romaine lettuce and other different products that over the years have had huge nationwide recalls. Right? We all are informed about that, and I just think transparency. You know, sunlight is always the best disinfectant in so many ways. And the other thing about the lack of transparency is that Illinois law allows them to take certain actions against bad actors in secret. Like, they could, if there's a cultivator that has a pattern of doing something wrong, either not logging their product properly, or somehow losing track of things, or just being lax, the state can take action against them and do it privately through an administrative action that is never made public. And I just think that the industry, to have the confidence of consumers and be this great, wonderful, thriving industry, transparency is the key. I think you don't want to let your customer base down by having so much opaque stuff going on. That's my little rant.
Yeah,
I love it.
I think that brings up an important point, which is that there is a lot of these privacy provisions that are embedded into the legalization law. And in fact, a lot of them are very protectionist, right, of the industry. And so, you know, who actually owns these companies, how much money each dispensary is being made. All of these things are a benefit to cannabis companies, and it's not transparent. And what's happening on this side of things with enforcement completely falls in line with that. So it's part of a larger trend of how, you know, we've legalized this new thing that is generating a ton of money for the state, yet the state hasn't ensured that you know the sale of it and what's happening behind the scenes is transparent and can be known by the public.
Yeah. And Stephanie, I got a question for you on the note of like consumer choice, standards and such. In your article, you included a really important detail. Sorry, I'm fishing through all the articles right now. Once again, folks, we'll have them in the show notes. In the article, you mentioned something that I like to talk about all the time, which is that a product that fails testing can actually be remediated and resubmitted as a concentrate, an infused product. And the keyword here is that the concentrate has to pass testing too, folks. Don't get scared. But on the note of like just being, transparent and open with consumers, and looking at the way that other industries function, do you think there should be more transparency regarding the use of remediation technology in cannabis?
That is a really interesting question because I learned a lot about the remediation stuff just reporting this. And just for listeners that don't know, if there's a flower sample, a batch of flower that gets tested at a lab and fails one of the state tests, it depending on what it failed, right? So if it fails yeast and mold, that's usually what it's failing. Yeah. It can be made into something else. It can't be resold as flour. It's done. It gets one strike and it's out. But it can be changed into something else. It could be they basically process it using solvents and they make it into, maybe it ends up being a vape cartridge or something like that. And it's totally safe, and it needs to be retested and pass all tests. If it fails again, and these processed products are usually failing for too much leftover solvent that's used in the process, it still is in there. It can be actually remediated again if it's in that state, and it can be cleaned up and sold and be perfectly fine and safe. One of the lab guys that we interviewed in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, said it's a little bit like cooking a pizza in an oven. You put the pizza in, and maybe like the first time you check it, the cheese is like a little too white and it's not really bubbling yet. Then you put it back in the oven and cook it a little bit longer, and it's bubbly and brown and perfect the way you want it. So that's just part of the way they make those products. And it's like you said, it's not like it's bad or anything. It can continually be remediated if it's in that state. It's an interesting question about whether there should be something on the label that says something about the process that it underwent. I think that would be interesting. And again, I love transparency. It would be an interesting question about whether they should put on the label exactly how it was processed and how many times it was processed. That would be an interesting thing. I wonder if that would be a heavy lift or too much of a request for the cannabis companies, because they probably wouldn't want to necessarily put all that on the label. But it is very interesting. Maybe it could be something that could end up on a COA.
Well, yeah, and to your point, consumer choice mandates that irradiated food, for example, be adequate. I'm reading off the FDA's website. Be adequately labeled, and under the general labeling requirements, it's necessary that the food processor inform the consumer that food has been irradiated. Labeling of irradiated foods, however, is undergoing reevaluation in the U.S. I think FDA has some requirements for whole foods that have been irradiated. So they require the label bear the Radura symbol and the phrase treated with radiation or treated by irradiation. Now, to your point, so first of all, not everybody uses irradiation as a form of remediation. Some people use ozone technology. Some people use other technologies that are almost like Christmas magic. But because to your point, because the words radiation and irradiation may have negative consequences, the labeling requirement has been viewed as an obstacle to consumer acceptance. And many in the food industry believe that an alternative wording such as electronically pasteurized might be helpful. But at the end of the day, I think that, because I want to be clear, I bring up remediation on the show a lot. the FDA has done a pretty good write up. If you guys want to read, I'll throw the link in the show notes. The overview of irradiation, food, and packaging. Um, for all intents and purposes, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the WHO, Food and Agriculture Organization, the United Nations, and other expert groups have uniformly concluded that food irradiation does not present any enhanced toxicological, microbiological, or nutritional hazard. So I want to be very clear that I'm not saying that there are any issues with the application of the technology. I've simply been trying to point out that there's a lack of transparency. If you look at Canadian companies, for example, because Canada does have a federal requirement, I say federal, whatever the hell it is over there, a nationwide requirement for certain foods. I believe it's potatoes, a few other things, and now cannabis is in that criteria from what I read, and they require that it be labeled if irradiated. And so companies have made statements on it, but it just seems that there's a hesitancy to even make a statement on it here. And of course, there's no regulations to be open about it. So sorry, I rambled, but I thought you'd like that part since your background in consumer products and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I did not realize that Canada requires it. I think it's always fascinating to look at what other industrialized nations do with consumer products. Like, just kind of going down a slight tangent, but many of the chemicals in consumer products that we use, cosmetic products and sunscreens and things like that, there are way stricter regulations in the EU compared to the US for certain types of chemicals used in fragrances and things like that. So it's always interesting to see what other countries are doing, and that's very interesting that Canada is doing that. I wonder if that would ever come to the United States. I mean, if it did, I would imagine it would be someday, like far over the horizon, when this is all legal nationwide, coast to coast in the US. Because it seems to me that getting that kind of transparency, I mean, sometimes California is ahead of the curve. You could see maybe California requiring that kind of transparency. Mm-hmm. I wonder though, to get that as an everyday occurrence, if that would be somewhere down the line. It's just hard for me to imagine some of these states willingly requiring that to be on the label, but it is an interesting thing. And I like I said, I'm always a big fan of transparency. Let the consumer have the information. Don't treat people like babies, and let them have the information, and they can figure out on their own whether or not, that's something that they want.
Yeah. Oh, and I did a quick Google. It looks like I was wrong. There's only certain cases in which the foods in Canada and cannabis have to be labeled. So I wanted to do your own research, folks. I am not an expert on everything, but I wanted to throw that out there. And really the reason I bring it up there as we start to wrap up the show, you mentioned not only the state of Illinois opening a lab, but also in your article, you mentioned that Verano is creating a new in-house lab to help spot and prevent problems with quality control. And so the topic of remediation comes up because we've heard that most cannabis companies just choose to remediate before testing because of the fact that Illinois standards are so strict. When you have talked to Colt, did you my question is, did you sense a preponderance of this technology? Did you sense it was a must or part of their protocol? Because that's kind of the sense that a lot of people get. And I didn't know if through your investigation you picked up on that, or if it was just kind of an aside comment.
I think Tom talked to a couple folks who do that, but Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I think remediation technology is increasingly common, and it's something that people are leaning on. I think it's just you're so many of these companies have really kind of, I think, are just trying to maximize their profits. Like they have shareholders, Verano has shareholders, Cresco has shareholders. So making sure you aren't losing batches, which depending on the size could be worth tons of money to an average person. So yeah, I think leaning on these new technologies for remediation is more and more common. But the one thing is the technologies are changing so rapidly.
Yeah.
More and more people are getting into this field and coming out with different remediation techniques and technologies. So I think it's kind of a developing aspect of the industry, but definitely something that I think the big dogs are keeping a close eye on and beginning to rely on.
Cool. A few last questions and points that I wanted to kind of bring up, and then I want to make sure I give you the floor for anything you feel maybe we haven't mentioned, and then we can start to wrap up the show if that sounds good. So you had gotten a statement from state regulators, and they said that the Sun Times tests show that legal weed is safer than what's on the street. They said the product tested showed no evidence of heavy metals, E. coli, salmonella, or detectable mycotoxins or pesticide residue, all common in the illicit market. Did they have any data that they were able to provide to you to back up that statement?
No.
I didn't
No,
figure
they
because
hadn't
product in the
surveyed
black
illicit market. No.
Gotcha. That's the thing. I mean, I figure products in the illicit market aren't often tested. So
No.
maybe that's the
No,
point
they're
they were
never.
trying to make, but it just seems weird to make that definitive statement without data to back it up,
Yeah, I don't know if this was a allusion to the vape gate
Sure.
vaporizer cartridges that
Yeah. Sorry to bother you.
I'm on a call right
Yeah. Does he have his own desk? Okay.
Sorry, I'm in the
It's all good. It's all good.
Yeah, so what I was saying was I don't know, they mentioned heavy metals. I'm assuming this is alluding to the vape gate stuff.
Mhm.
I think most product is on the black market is manufactured, transported, sold, and consumed without any interdiction by authorities who would have the opportunity to test it. And even if it is taken off the street, if a police officer in Alsip finds 5 ounces of weed, I don't think they're taking that to the lab and testing it. I think they're just tagging it, putting it in an evidence container. So, no, they did not give us any, data or test results or anything to back up, what their claim is, that this, affirms that the products that are being sold legally are safer than the illegal products. But I think, the assumption is that product, or the reality is the products on the black market aren't tested and aren't subject to any regulation. So
Yeah.
whether the issue with mold, the thing that we identified and found, mold, from what I understand, is found commonly in marijuana that's a little moister, a little wetter, and I think a big complaint among legal cannabis buyers in Illinois is that the marijuana is dry when they buy it off the shelves, right? It's overly dry. It feels old. And I think that having weed dry out is a tactic to, allow to kill some of that mold. So, if you're getting weed on the black market and it's really, quote unquote, dank, as they say, you may be exposing yourself to mold just by the fact of what part of the process the cannabis is in. But that wasn't something we were able to do. It was something that we would have loved to do, to go and find some illegal weed and to test it. But there's I don't.
Our bosses would kill us.
Yeah, we can't be breaking the law to report the news, unfortunately.
I hear you. Hey, so two more questions, and admittedly, the first one is for both of you, but it came up in spirit from a comment that Stephanie made, and then the last one is more geared towards Stephanie, but feel free still to weigh in, Tom. Stephanie, earlier you mentioned, and I admittedly these could be construed as opinion, but I'm just maybe even asking you guys as experts, I guess, in this field. You mentioned that regulations for cannabis are split amongst many agencies. I would say too many agencies. So you listed off IDPH, IDFPR, the Illinois Department of Agriculture, and I might even be missing one or two. Other states like Michigan, for example, have the MRA, the Michigan or the Marijuana Regulatory Agency. I think that's what it stands for. It's a central body that is able to make some decisions. Do you think, again, I realize this is kind of an opinion question, but do you think Illinois would benefit from a central body? I know it'd probably make your guys' job easier if you had one person to go to.
That's right. As reporters, we'd only have one place to bug. I mean, it's not for me to say, but you do have to kind of wonder when it's so decentralized. Like, for example, when that Mag Landrace thing happened that Tom uncovered, and he found it by looking at the Reddit thread from your listeners. The Mag Landrace quarantine thing was actually officially undertaken by the Department of Business and Financial Regulation, which oversees the dispensaries. But it's weed that's coming from a cultivator, right? Verano, which is overseen by the Department of Agriculture. And we have to imagine that there were probably phone calls back and forth between the people from these agencies. But wouldn't it be a lot simpler if it were all one umbrella or whatever, one regulator doing all of it, right? Because some of this stuff spills over from cultivator to dispensary, and right now we have this weird kind of decentralized system. It's and you also kind of wonder, if it were like one cannabis regulatory authority, you might be able to assemble like the people with the most expertise in just cannabis in one place, as opposed to people who are required to be experts in many different things if they work for the, overseeing all of Illinois agriculture, right? You got to know about soybeans and everything else. And then the Department of Business and Professional, I always say that wrong, Financial and Business, whatever, IDFPR. Those folks oversee all kinds of professions that are regulated in Illinois, everybody from dental hygienists to, a million other people, locksmiths or whatever they regulate, right? So it's not for me to say, but just sort of intuitively you wonder if it might make more sense to just put it all in one place. It's such a big industry. There's so much going on, and it's a lot. And it seems like if you had one place, it would make more sense. I don't know. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, as a cannabis reporter, even the greatest example of this, I think, is you mentioned like you have Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, dispensaries, Department of Ag, which does cultivation centers, and then you have the Department of Public Health, which has been involved with the medical program and oversaw that prior to recreational, all involved. And then, you have all the other agencies that are involved with the revenue side of it. And then you have like Toy Hutchinson was named as Pritzker's key advisor on cannabis, right? And when she was named, she was referred to as the cannabis czar. And then it was like, oh, well, no, she's not the cannabis czar. And then they named Danielle Perry the cannabis regulation oversight officer. And then they started calling her the cannabis czar. And they were serving at the same time. And I was like, well, where's the head of the beast on this thing? Like where does everything run down from? And even as a cannabis reporter, that's hard to parse through. Obviously, Toy has left or is leaving. I'm not sure where she's at right now, but she's going to the Marijuana Policy Project, which was is a key lobbying firm that helped write the legalization law in Illinois. But yeah, it's a weird kind of system where there's all of these different pieces, and to get the full picture of certain things, like we had to for this story, we had to reach out to all of these different agencies and kind of pull together different things. And I think it would make sense to have some sort of unified office or agency created within the state government that can kind of pool all of this stuff together and all these resources together to make sure that there's coordination and oversight that's done in a kind of uniform manner.
Yeah, it'd probably make your job a little bit easier, like I said, too. So
it would.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, last question. And again, it's sorry if it seems like I'm asking for your opinion, but Stephanie, you just mentioned looking at many other industries like involving consumer packaged goods. If I just think it's interesting, THC percentage which is something you mentioned in your article. You kind of talk about potency testing, and generally speaking, potency is thought of the level of THC, which for our listeners know that paradigm is slowly but surely changing. But as of now, THC levels are kind of what people sell cannabis off of, and everything else. It really is what drives the industry. I mean, for example, Brownie Scout, which is a strain by, I think, GTI, tested out with 35% THC apparently, and it made headlines in High Times, right? So I guess my question is, it's interesting how we have our tax scale set up, right? Anything exceeding, like, I think 30 or 35% THC is subject to a higher tax rate. And the reason I think that's especially strange is because, typically speaking, like concentrates, for example, or vape pens are seen as healthier options because you're not smoking, right? I'm not saying any of it's healthy, but generally speaking, we agree that, or it seems like the notion rather is that vaping is more healthy. And so I don't know, I'm comparing it to like soda, for example, in Illinois. Soda is subject to higher taxes because it's less healthy. So it's interesting that the healthier options in Illinois cannabis are taxed higher, arguably. Have you ever thought about it that way?
That's an interesting thought. Well, first of all, I'm not going to go out on a limb and say that vaping is healthy. So
no, yeah, I don't want to.
Yeah.
I want to be very clear, because somebody said that to me. They're like, or no, I think we were talking, with smart approaches to marijuana, and they were saying, like, people say that cannabis is healthier than alcohol or whatever, and I was like, comparing, that's kind of hard to do, but I think at a bare minimum, anybody that's rational agrees that probably smoking or inhaling an aerosol is just by sheer nature not healthy, right? But comparatively speaking, it's the notion seems to be that vaping's a bit healthier, right? So
right, yeah. It is. I get what you're saying. It is. I think people have viewed Illinois and have given compliments to Illinois' setup for doing that different higher tax rate on the THC levels that are 35% and up. I've only heard like positive things about that from just, chatter.
Sure.
Tom could probably weigh in more from what he hears from industry folks. I think like what you were originally saying about how you try to educate your listeners about sort of all of the components that go into making whatever product you're using enjoyable, and having a high THC level is not necessarily, like, if you're more of a connoisseur, you're looking more for like all of it, like the taste profile and just like all the different things that go into it, right? And I almost view it like, when you're a teen, well, okay, so now I'm going to say that I did illegal things as a teenager, but when I grew up in Wisconsin and the drinking age was 18 then. And so pretty much every high school kid in Wisconsin would drink. And, the dumb boys would go for high percentage alcohol because it would get you drunk faster. And that's like all they really knew. Now, those people are men in their 50s now. And I guarantee you that's not how they're buying their alcohol. They're probably finding a nice bottle of Merlot that they enjoy the taste profile of that particular wine. It's like becoming more sophisticated in your taste. And I think because cannabis is so new and there's so many brand new people, we're really at this like almost infantile phase where people just see a THC number, they're like, yeah, that's what I want. Whereas I think as time goes by and people, and thankfully because of podcasts like yours and, places where people can come together as a community and exchange information, I think as time goes by, people will get more sophisticated, and THC is not going to be like their number one driving thing. Tom, maybe you have more information about what you've heard about Illinois' kind of bifurcated taxing system where they tax the higher THC at a higher level. I mean, I've only heard compliments like from consumer advocates, but I don't know, maybe you've heard other stuff from industry folks.
Yeah, likewise. I've heard the same sort of that they think this is a better way of approaching it than some other states have to set it by THC levels and increase the tax rates based on that. But you know, I think everything's kind of subject to change. You're also putting the state in a position where you know the maybe products that people are buying less are being taxed more. So maybe they're going to want to change that to make sure that they maximize the tax revenue that they're able to collect from cannabis. But I think what you said, Cole, earlier kind of hits the nail on the head. The THC value being the biggest thing for people purchasing, I think is beginning to fall by the wayside. People are becoming very strain conscious now. That's a big thing, and I'm hoping that in stores in the state of Illinois there will be more awareness and more kind of advertising of, there's always new strains, there's always crosses, so there's all these new names. You may not recognize them, but I think it would benefit shops to show, oh, this strain is whatever, purple whoopsie doodle or whatever, and it comes from this and this. So that people can know, oh, well, that has, sour diesel or another kind of old lineage strain, and I like that, so I'm going to buy that. People are definitely becoming aware of that. People are also becoming aware of their terpenes, and as we wrote about, terpenes are included in many COAs, certificates of analysis, and so I think consumer awareness and consumer understanding of the products will increase. And I think there'll be continued kind of shift away from just like, what's the strongest weed there is, to, well, what weed agrees with me the most. And perhaps when that shifts more, then the approach to taxation will also kind of follow suit around that.
Yeah, well, on that note, I think the only thing we didn't mention, and I'll put this in the show notes as well, you have a interactive database which people can search for legal cannabis failures. You can see which cannabis products failed state mandated inspections. So if you want to search through that database, we'll have the link in the description. And you mentioned purple whoopsie daisy. I think my strain of purple whoopsie daisy is calling my name right now. I think it's time to spark up some cannabis. So on that note, I don't even know if that's a real strain, Tom, but I love the name. It's going to be a real strain.
Yeah, so feel free to take that. Any growers on here?
Yeah, just
I
put
guess royalties.
Yeah, I was going to say, give Tom royalties on the name,
on
please. Cool. Well, on that note, folks, I've been sitting down with Tom Schuba and Stephanie Zimmermann from the Chicago Sun-Times. Once again, the stories we've discussed are all in the show notes. We didn't do a large discussion on the understanding legal weed labels, but do check that out. It's a really short and simple article, and I believe our friend Margot Vaselli is even featured in that article. So it's a familiar name for you guys to read about. Tom, Stephanie, I want to thank you so much for setting aside time in your very busy schedule to sit down with me on the Chillinois podcast.
Thank you so much. This was great. We really appreciate it. You do great work. Thanks so much, Cole.
Yeah,
that means a lot.
Pleasure, Cole. And thanks. I mean, Cole was a huge asset and resource for actually doing this reporting, and your network of pot consumers is very engaged and very well educated, and helped us along this road. So it's much appreciated, and we're glad to be here.
Thank you. That means a lot coming from both of you. And on that note, we'll make sure maybe in the future, when it becomes more COVID safe, we can get together and share a joint of some purple whoopsie daisy. Sound good?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, Chillinois, we'll see you next time.